Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video we will look further at Wittgenstein's Tractatus. So I had gotten up to 4.1 and that's where I will now start. So here's proposition 4.1. Propositions represent the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. So let's recall that according to Wittgenstein, at the most basic level, language consists of names of simple objects. And those names are formed together into certain constellations that are sentences or propositions, and those constellations function as pictures of reality. And so when a sentence presents to us a certain picture of reality, it tells us that that picture is real, in other words, that this state of affairs that is pictured actually obtains or exists. So, sentences, in that sense, represent the existence of states of affairs. And because we have something like the logical connective not, we can also construct sentences that represent the non-existence of a state of affairs. Right? You just take a sentence, you put not in front of it, and the new sentence represents the non-existence of the state of affairs that was presented as existent by the earlier sentence or proposition. So it's fairly logical that Wittgenstein is telling us what he is telling us here. Right? What do propositions do? They represent the world, they represent the existence or non-existence, or existence and non-existence, I suppose, of one or more states of affairs. So it's logical given what Wittgenstein has been telling us. But as a theory of language, it is extremely radical. Because we can think of many types of sentences that do not seem to fit this scheme. And I'll give you just a few examples. Here's one example. Murder is bad. You know, that kind of evaluation, moral evaluation, doesn't really seem to describe a state of affairs. Right? It seems to be a sentence of a different type. Okay. What about 2 plus 2 is 4? Right? Does that describe the existence of a state of affairs? Right? Out there in the world? Do I need to check the objects in the world to find out whether 2 plus 2 is 4 or maybe it's 5? No. Right? 2 plus 2 is 4 doesn't seem to be the kind of sentence that gives us a picture of reality. Or what about this one? Propositions represent the existence and non-existence of state of affairs. Is that itself a proposition that represents the existence or non-existence of states of affairs? Doesn't look like it. So, Wittgenstein could go either of two ways, right? One way he could go is he could say, no, look, those types of sentences that you just mentioned, they actually do represent states of affairs in reality. That's not the way that Wittgenstein is going to take. The way that Wittgenstein is going to take, he's going to say, yeah, that's right. Those are not propositions. They're not real propositions, at least. They're not meaningful propositions. You can say things like, murder is bad, 2 plus 2 is 4, propositions represent the existence and non-existence of states of affairs, but you're not really using language in what we could call the proper way. You're not really making claims that could be true or false. Right? These are not meaningful claims that could be true or false in anything like the usual sense. Let's scrap that. They just can't be true or false. So, what Wittgenstein is going to tell us next is this. He says the totality of true propositions is the whole of natural science. So all the true propositions that anyone could ever speak, all of that together forms natural science, in a very broad sense of the word, right? I mean, as a full description of what reality is like, what this external reality is like. So, philosophy doesn't do that, right? Philosophy is not in the business of describing like states of affairs in the world, and so it's not one of the natural sciences, and that's 4.111. Philosophy is not one of the natural sciences. But that means that philosophy is not in the business of presenting true propositions. Right? Philosophers talk, they seem to be making claims, but they're not in the business of giving you true propositions. So what are they doing? Well, here is 4.112. Philosophy aims at the logical clarification of thoughts. Philosophy is not a body of doctrine, but an activity. And this is actually picked up by the Vienna Circle, the logical positivists, a little bit later on, people like Schlick, Neurath, Carnap. They will be saying this exact same thing. Philosophy is not about generating true sentences, true claims. You're not building a theory. You're engaging in an activity. What's the point of the activity? Well, a philosophical work consists essentially of elucidations. Philosophy does not result in philosophical propositions, but rather in the clarification of propositions. Without philosophy, thoughts are, as it were, cloudy and indistinct. Its task is to make them clear and give them sharp boundaries. So, philosophers are not making claims that we have to test for truth or falsity. When we're doing philosophy, we're hopefully clearing up our thinking. Right? And one way we're clearing up our thinking is that we're getting rid of a lot of so-called philosophy. Right? One of the main aims that Wittgenstein sees for good philosophy is getting rid of bad philosophy. Right? Showing us that all these questions that we've been wondering about, that we've been trying to answer, they're not real questions. There are no answers to them. It doesn't even make sense to think that there could be answers to them, because any potential answer to them would not be a description of states of affairs, and so could not be true or false. Right? So we see here how Wittgenstein's theory of language and Wittgenstein's theory of philosophy are two sides of the same coin. Of course, this raises questions, right? I mean, what is Wittgenstein taking himself to be doing? Why is he writing all these propositions, or things that look like propositions? What is the status of that? And he's going to come back to that later on. Here's another interesting thing that Wittgenstein tells us. He says, 4.114, philosophy must set limits to what can be thought. It must set limits to what can be thought, and in doing so, to what cannot be thought. I actually like the Ramsey Ogden translation better here. It should limit the thinkable and thereby the unthinkable. It will mean the unspeakable by clearly displaying the speakable. It should limit the unthinkable from within through the thinkable. So there seems to be these two realms, right? The realm of the thinkable and the realm of the unthinkable. And usually we sort of veer off into the unthinkable and we do all kinds of bad things, like philosophically speaking. We write texts that are actually completely meaningless. And what real philosophy ought to be doing is to draw the boundary between the thinkable and the unthinkable. Now, one of the biggest questions in Tractatus studies that scholars completely disagree about is the status of this unthinkable. So there are people who think that the unthinkable for Wittgenstein is, so to say, fairly substantial. You can't think it because it's unthinkable, but there's a sense in which you can intuit it, right? There's a sense in which it can show itself to you. There's a sense in which you can have some kind of mystical relation to it. And so there's some mystical element to philosophy because it wants to get us in touch with the unthinkable and clarify the line between the thinkable, where we make true propositions, and the unthinkable, where maybe we rely on this kind of mystical relationship or something like that. There are other Wittgenstein interpreters who say, no, look, I mean, the unthinkable is just unthinkable, which means that there's nothing substantial about it, right? You can't even really say that it's there. But you can't even really draw a boundary between the thinkable and the unthinkable, because the very thought that beyond the boundary there's the unthinkable would itself be an unthinkable thought. And there are no unthinkable thoughts, right? I mean, you can't think an unthinkable thought. You can maybe write sentences that are meaningless and think that you're writing something that's meaningful because you haven't thought well, but you can't think the unthinkable or grasp it in any other way. Okay, so I'm just flagging that this is a big discussion about interpreters who are interested in the Tractatus. Okay, and we'll no doubt meet this discussion again as we go on through the text. 4.12. Propositions can represent the whole of reality, but they cannot represent what they must have in common with reality in order to be able to represent it. Logical form. So propositions can represent anything in reality. If there's something in reality, a proposition could represent it, and maybe there could even be some monstrously large proposition that represents all of reality, the whole of reality. But there are things that propositions can't represent. And among the things that they can't represent is their own relation to reality. Right? Because a proposition represents reality. It doesn't represent the relation between a proposition and reality. So if I try to say something like, this proposition is about reality, that can't itself be a meaningful proposition. If I say something like, well, this proposition talks about 17 distinct objects, that again can't be a real meaningful proposition. This also holds for the relations between propositions themselves. If I say this proposition logically follows from that proposition, or if I say this proposition is the negation of that proposition, or if I say these two propositions are contradictory, I am not describing a state of affairs in reality, and so I am not speaking a meaningful proposition. So, one of the things that does not belong to natural science and that cannot consist of true propositions is logic. Right? Logic, like describing the logical relationships between sentences or between sentences and the world, that itself can't consist of meaningful propositions. And so propositions really cannot represent their logical form. They can't talk about themselves and about their logical form. But that doesn't mean that propositions can do nothing with their logical form. It's just that they can't express it. What they can do, according to 4.121, is they can show it. Propositions show the logical form of reality. They display it. Now this word show, which in German is zeigen, that's a very important word for the Tractatus, and it's a word that comes up constantly in the discussions that I just mentioned between people who think that the unthinkable is fairly substantial or that it's like just really unthinkable for Wittgenstein. And one of the central questions there is, okay, what is this showing? Right? I mean, does this showing sort of give us a grasp of some non-propositional truth or something like that? Or is something else going on? Well, one thing that's clear is that Wittgenstein thinks that we can see something from propositions, right? If I have two propositions that are contradictory, I can see that they're contradictory, that they can't both be true. I can't really meaningfully say that, but I can see it, right? They show it to me. They don't say it, right? This proposition doesn't say I'm contradictory with that one, and that one doesn't say I'm contradictory with this one. But if I look at both of them, I see that they are contradictory, right? That seems to be something that Wittgenstein wants to be saying. He also tells us that you can't say it, right? You can't express this in language. What can be shown cannot be said, he tells us in 4.1212. So there are things that propositions can show, but that no proposition can say. Right? Meaningful propositions show their logical form, show their logical relations to each other and reality. They don't express that form. They don't express or say anything about that relation. And Wittgenstein then goes on to sort of explicate this again, but now in terms of using the word internal. He talks about internal relations, internal properties. And basically what it means, I mean, it's the kind of thing that they show, right? I mean, if I have these two sentences, then there's an internal relation between them, that they contradict each other. And that's not something that's external. It doesn't come from their relation to the world or something like that. They have it in themselves. So that's a little bit of terminology that Wittgenstein introduces here. And I don't want to go too deeply into that, but I do want to say something about one internal relation that he's going to talk about, because I think it can maybe use some explication. And this is in 4.1252. So in 4.1252, Wittgenstein is interested basically in numbers. It's going to be a serious question for him, which he gets from Russell, which he gets from Frege. How should we think about numbers? Numbers are not in reality. Are they in language? Are they in logic? How do we sort of get them? How do we construct them? And here we get sort of a first attempt, you could say, at constructing numbers. So Wittgenstein is going to construct a series of propositions that we can understand as a series of propositions about numbers. So the first proposition is ARB. Right? There's A, small a, that's a name of an object. B is a name of an object. R is some relation between them. So I've got A and B, and they are in the relation R. Then the next sentence in the list is there is an X. So some X, this is a variable. There's an X, some object, such that A has relation R to X, and X has relation R to B. Next sentence, there is an X and there is a Y, such that A has R to X has R to Y, and Y has R to B, and so on. And then Wittgenstein tells us that if B stands in one of these relations to A, I call B a successor of A. Well, that suggests a particular interpretation, right? And the interpretation that it suggests is that R is something like is a direct successor of, right? Is the next number. So ARB would mean that B is the next number after A. So if A is 7, then B is 8. The second sentence, there is an X such that ARX and XRB would then have the interpretation that B is the successor of like the number after A, so it's A plus 2, right? So we can read the first sentence as A plus 1 is B, and we can read the second sentence as A plus 2 is B, and we can read the third sentence as A plus 3 is B, and so on, right? So here we have a sort of fragment, you could say, a sort of first attempt at a fragment of arithmetic, of mathematics, in a sort of purely logical way, where we don't have to worry about objects. Right? A and B are names of objects, but we don't even have to care about what objects they are. And maybe we could even do without them. Right? I mean, maybe we could even sort of try to use only variables. But certainly we don't need to worry about what A and B are. And we can sort of generate all these further number claims just by looking at this logical form. And that's going to be Wittgenstein's basic idea about mathematics, right? Mathematics has to do with the manipulation of logical form. It is not about a sort of realm of numbers that are either out there in physical reality or in some Platonic heaven or wherever. No, this is how we get to numbers, right? We use internal relationships between these sort of terms that have particular logical forms in common, or relations between their logical forms. Let's see. Here's what I want to point out, what I want to talk about next. 4.127. The propositional variable signifies the formal concept, and its values signify the objects that fall under the concept. So the X and Y that we just saw, those were propositional variables. And Wittgenstein is claiming that it's the variables that signify a formal concept. Okay, what does that mean? Well, let's read 4.1272. Thus, the variable name X is the proper sign for the pseudo-concept object. Okay, so Wittgenstein is wondering, what do we mean with object, right? Where object is the most general term, such that anything could be called an object, right? If there's anything to be called anything at all, you can call it an object. Well, Wittgenstein says, like, the only way to think about that, the right way to think about that, the right way to represent object in language is to use a variable. So, for instance, if I want to say there are two objects which are red. Well, there are two objects on my table. Why not? There are two objects on my table. What does that look like? Well, it looks like this, according to Wittgenstein. There is an X and there is a Y, such that X is on my table and Y is on my table. And Y is not X, maybe. So, if I want to say there are two objects on my table, I say there is an X and there is a Y, such that X is on my table and Y is on my table. And X and Y are distinct. I didn't mention object anymore, right? I turned object into these X and Y's. And that's the right thing to do, according to Wittgenstein. What I should not have done is say, oh, well, look, there is an X and there is a Y, such that X is on my table and X is an object, and Y is on my table and Y is an object. That's the wrong thing to do. Why? Well, one reason to see that is that, look, it doesn't make any sense to say that something is an object, because it doesn't make any sense to say that it's not an object. Right? If object is this most general term that necessarily applies to everything, then if I say, ooh, this pen is not an object, I'm not representing a possible state of affairs in reality. Right? I mean, it makes no sense. It makes no sense to say that this pen is not an object. In the same way that it would make no sense to say that 3 is not a number. And that also, for Wittgenstein, shows that there are certain things that we shouldn't say. Right? We shouldn't try to use number as a concept like that and then say 3 is a number. Rather, number itself should appear as a kind of variable. Right? A kind of variable in a certain kind of formal use of language, maybe, where I can express something like, oh, there is an X such that X is the successor of the successor of the successor of 0. Right? That is sort of a claim about 3, but I no longer use this concept of number. So here we have an example of Wittgenstein trying to do philosophy in such a way that it clarifies things. Because Wittgenstein thinks that once we do this, there are a lot of claims that we used to make, but that we are now no longer making. Right? So maybe we used to say things like, there are objects. Why are there objects? Oh, now we are so deep in philosophy. Why are there objects? Okay, for Wittgenstein, we have now crossed the threshold into the unthinkable. We're just spouting nonsense. Right? There are objects, or why are there objects? I mean, that's all just nonsense. Don't think like that. And again, for Wittgenstein, this means that a lot of bad philosophy, we're going to be able to get rid of that. Right? Once we see clearly that words like object or number, these very formal general terms, are not especially interesting things that philosophy needs to develop a theory about, but they're just variables that we use in our language, then a lot of bad philosophy is going to fall by the wayside, and we have really clarified our own way of thinking. So that is what I wanted to say about the 4.1s. Right? Of course, I didn't talk about everything, but I think we've seen some of the main lines, seen some of the most important things that happen here. And in our next video, we will start at 4.2.